Hello, folks. I hope all of you are doing well. Since we're drawing near, getting toward the end of this course, we're not quite there yet. I'm sure there's some mixed emotions about that. Some of you are probably thinking, "Good, I've still got more time to get my work done." Others of you are probably thinking, "When will this darn class be over with?" But if you are feeling that way, hang in there. I'll do my best to get you through it, but it won't be that much longer. But acknowledging that it won't be that much longer, I thought it might be a good idea to pause at this moment and give you some general tips on how to proofread, edit, and revise your papers. Now, as I've talked to you about before, as long as you turn the original final drafts in on time in accordance with Terra State Community College policy, you are allowed to submit one revised version of each of your essays in the hopes of getting up to one letter grade higher on each of those papers. So I want to give you then some general tips that I hope will help you when you do choose to begin that process of revising and kind of fine tuning your papers. So, first and foremost, I just want to make sure that all of you know that there is, in fact, a difference between editing and revising. I'll admit that one of my bad habits as a teacher is I tend to use when I make comments on your essays and so forth. I tend to use those terms editing and revising a bit more interchangeably than what I really should. So, particularly if any of you have an English class or just another college level course down the road in which the teacher is a real sort of stickler for knowing the difference between those two terms and executing the difference properly, I want to make sure you know that there is, in fact, a difference, as I said, between editing and revising a text. When we edit a text, we are mainly looking at smaller level details like grammar and sentence structure versus when we revise an essay, you tend to look more at big picture details like organization, paragraph development, and the overall thought process of an essay. So here then are just some general tips that I'd like you to kind of keep in your mind as you begin the process of fine tuning your own papers. Probably the biggest thing, whether you need to edit an essay, revise an essay, or just generally proofread it. The biggest thing that you need to do, especially if you had to do it by yourself, is to let your essay gather some dust before you start to make any changes to it. Now, what I mean by that is when you finish a draft, before you revise it or make any changes, you kind of want to let it sit for a little while and just sort of detach yourself from it. Because if you finish a draft and then, like 10 minutes later, try to, go right through it and pick out all your mistakes, it's very hard to do that on a quick turnaround because the essay is still too new to you in a way. You've gotta, to kind of break away from it a lot of times in order to pick out some of your own mistakes in a more efficient manner. Just as an example, there are different, depending on what kind of text you're working on, there are different lengths of time for which you should let it gather dust before you go back and revise, edit, or proofread it. For instance, I remember reading an article a long time ago about the well-known novelist Stephen King, and in that article it said that when he would finish a draft of a novel, he would let that draft of a novel basically sit for up to a year and work on other things before he would go back and begin to revise it, because he needed that time away in order to really be able to form some solid sort of self-critical but not self-condemning uh, you know thoughts about that text. Now I realize that all of you do not have the luxury, if you will, of letting your papers sit for a year before you proofread, edit, or revise them. But for a course like this, a good guideline is, again, especially if you have to proofread it yourself, let it kind of sit for a day, finish it, move on, do some other things for a day, spend time with your family, visit with your friends, whatever, but forget about that paper for a day. I think that's a good guideline for the type of work that we're doing here. Um, Second point, especially if you're, working on revisions, when you go over your paper, try to think about um, the big picture of your paper. So, just in an example of how I go about doing this, when I work on an essay, when I finish it, and after I've let it sit for that day or so, I always kind of ask myself, when I started this project, what did I have in mind? What did I want to prove or demonstrate with this paper? That's always sort of my uh, big uh, big picture question number one. Question number two, then, for me, and I think for many of you, would be uh, after my original idea that I had for the paper, when I actually wrote the essay out, what did that paper become? How is it similar to my original idea, and how is it different from my original idea? Then to follow that up, a logical question number three, acknowledging that there are going to be some differences in how you originally conceived an essay versus how it came out in that first draft. You got to look at it and say, okay, there are some differences here. Which of those differences are are acceptable? Can I leave in? Might even be helpful compared to what you originally had in mind. So, which of those differences can I leave in the essay? And which of the differences compared to my original idea for the paper do I either need to get rid of altogether or kind of remold a little bit so that it fits better within the confines of, again, what you're trying to do with that essay. And then kind of similar related sort of self-evaluation questions. Okay, you've got the original idea for the essay, you're kind of in stage two right now. You know, there's some things that are the same compared to what you originally thought the essay would be. Some things that are different. And then finally, what is your ultimate goal for the essay? What do you want it to become? What do you want it to prove? And out of that sort of mishmash, again, of similarities to the original idea and differences, um, which do you need to leave in? Which do you need to change? And then finally, when you think about that end point, you also want to think about, okay, originally I had idea X for my paper of what I wanted it to be about, what I wanted it to show. Now it's a little different. To what extent, rather than changing the content, maybe this essay, as part of looking at that picture, can you just say, I'm going to change my objective for what I want the essay to be about? And sometimes that's okay. You know, we have an initial plan for an essay, we move through the process, and things change. It is, even though this is kind of an overused, flowery metaphor, when you write out an essay, there is kind of a growth process, I think, that takes place because you have that initial kernel of an idea, you develop it, and it's always going to develop into something a little different, right, than what you thought it would be. So be aware that that's going to happen. You know, happens to all of us. No matter how good we plan out our essay at a time, there are always going to be those differences, but those differences are a natural part of that growth process. So don't necessarily think that because what you wrote doesn't mesh with the original idea that you necessarily did anything wrong or bad. I would urge you, at least initially, to just look at those differences as part of the overall development process of an essay. Another tip, I know I spent, more time on that second point than what I probably should have. But anyway, on to the next one. Let qualified partners look at your work. Um, no matter how experienced of a writer you are, it's always very difficult to evaluate your own work. For instance, one of my colleagues at BGSU Firelands College, you know, he's an experienced professor, got a PhD, very good writer in his own right, but this past summer when he wrote a book, he asked me to do a final proofreading of it for him before it was published because he knows, again, that it's very hard to pick out your own mistakes. So whenever possible, let a partner or partners look at your work with you and for you. But when you do that, make sure that your, proofreading partner is qualified. Now, ladies, I don't mean to pick on you, but usually when this happens, it is the ladies who will sometimes make this mistake, and that is um, if you got a child, in grade school, junior high, who's good at English at that level, parents will sometimes let them proofread their essays, thinking that young child will be a good partner to go over their work. And many times when that happens, it doesn't turn out that well. And I'll ask the student, did you have someone proofread your work, go over it with you? And they'll say yes. And then I'll ask them, naturally enough, well, who was it that went over your paper with you? And they'll say, oh, my son or daughter, but they're in sixth grade and they're absolutely a whiz at English, get A's on all their papers. Now, please, all you parents out there, I'm not trying to pick on you, not trying to make you feel bad, but just be aware there's a world of difference in the expectation level between what is expected of a sixth grade English student versus an English student at college. So again, make sure your partner is qualified. When we're talking about, you know, writing a college level essay, go to the writing center if at all possible. Or if you have a friend who's an English major, or one of your old English teachers in high school is willing to look at your paper for you. Again, those are all what I would qualify and what I would attest to as being a qualified proofreading partner. Especially if you had to proofread your paper by yourself, you want to read it out loud. That can be a very challenging, sometimes a very humbling experience when you do that. But reading out loud is an essential part of the proofreading process because that is really the only good way to detect um, errors related to what I usually just call awkwardness. So the idea is good, but when you say it, it just doesn't sound right. And again, to catch those kind of sound related errors, you really need to take the time to read the paper out loud. Um, if you're proofreading, editing, revising by yourself, you want to, as you're going through your paper, mark the paper, mark any mistakes that you find as you read through it. Um, don't think that you'll be able to catalog all those mistakes mentally and then go back and be able to find them all again later. Excuse me, folks, I'm not trying to show disinterest, but it is kind of late at the time that I'm recording this, and I am pretty tired, but apologies there. But again, um, mark your paper as you go. Don't think that you're going to be able to kind of relocate all those errors later. None of us are perfect especially when you're working on a longer essay. And for me, that would be an essay of 8 pages or more in length. To me is a long essay at this level. So be sure to, again, mark any of your own errors that you find as you go. Don't wait till the end to go back and find that again. Often it's just too hard to do. But one of the things that, and I know this is going to sound weird, that I really recommend you do, especially if you had to proofread your own papers, is doing what I call reading against the grain. So read your paper at least 3 times. The first time you read it, just read it in normal fashion, left to right, beginning to end. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then the second time that you read it, read the last sentence and then go back up to the sentence before that, the sentence before that, so on and so forth, until you get to the very beginning of the essay, and then in the final reading, the third reading, you can just read it from beginning to end again. But doing that process of what I call reading against the grain, of going from the end and then sort of backtracking to the beginning, it's a very challenging thing to do, very awkward admittedly, thing to do to read against the grain. But if you're willing to do that because it is an awkward process, I think you'll find that it'll really help you, especially when you're proofreading your own work, to find errors that you might not have otherwise detected. Because when you read against the grain like that, it is a very sort of unfamiliar process. And it forces then all of us to slow down in how we process that information. So finally, reading against the grain. That's it for now, folks, but as always, anything comes up, any questions or concerns, contact me. I want to help, want to see you do well. But until next time, take care, have a good evening, bye.